regarded as a development of the existentialist tradition, though he was far from being a direct follower of Kierkegaard, and in fact disagreed with him on several fundamental points. Unlike Kierkegaard, Husserl retained a certain belief in traditional philosophy, at least in its aims. Indeed, his starting point was an attempt to overcome the division between the two main strands of contemporary philosophy, namely rationalism and empiricism. The rationalist element was epitomized by its originator, the 16th-century Frenchman René Descartes. He based his systematic rational view of the world upon one bedrock certainty: cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The empiricist argument was most forcibly put by the 18th-century Scotsman David Hume, who maintained that we can know nothing for certain apart from what we actually experience. Even such things as causality can never be certain, for we never actually experience one thing causing another, simply a succession of events. Husserl tried to resolve this dichotomy by seeking some fundamental level which underlay both points of view. He declared that only by analyzing the immediate experience that precedes systematic thought can we discover the philosophical ground upon which such things as logic and mathematics, i.e., the domain of reason, are based. We must return to the immediacy of reality as it presents itself to our experience. This could be done only by analyzing the raw material of consciousness prior to the presuppositions or theories that we so habitually impose upon it. In other words, we must deal with the basic phenomena of our experience. To this activity Husserl gave the name phenomenology. In this way, Husserl sought to turn philosophy into an exact science. Mental acts could be described in a way that freed them from our prejudices about the objective nature of the world. They could also be analyzed in such a way as to free them from assumptions about their own nature. Thus, phenomenology would require a scrupulous and scientific examination of one's consciousness as well as of one's intellectual processes, so that one could determine the ultimate phenomena of experience and experience it as it is. Now Sartre could see what Aron meant when he said that even talking about a glass of apricot cocktail could be philosophy. By examining the sticky, bilious phenomena that constituted this encounter, we could come to philosophical conclusions about the nature of experience, our being and the world, and thus existence itself. This was existentialism. May you live in interesting times, says the old Chinese curse. Berlin in 1933 was about as interesting as it gets. Before Sartre's arrival in September, Hitler had won election as Chancellor of Germany, and during the ensuing year he set about consolidating his power, marching his stormtroopers through the streets with banners and flares, holding public book burnings, dissolving the trade unions, purging the civil service and academia of Jews. Here was ideal schooling for someone who was later to set himself up as one of the leading political theorists of our time. Or so one might think. But Sartre had something far more interesting to study: his own consciousness. Judging from most reports, Sartre spent his year in Berlin in a kind of solipsistic daze, straining to discern the pure, untrammeled phenomena of his experience. Meanwhile, the cabarets of Isherwood and Sally Bowles were being smashed to smithereens. This lack of concern for the phenomena of reality, what actually went on out there and how things worked in practice rather than theory, was to become a persistent feature of Sartre's philosophical activity. With regard to the epistemology and phenomenology of existentialism, this flaw remained implicit, but it was to become increasingly obvious as he developed a more political philosophy. In 1934, Sartre returned to teach at Le Havre. Here he began to keep a notebook of his phenomenological quest. De Beauvoir persuaded him to turn this into a novel. Eventually this would be called La Nausée, Nausea. It is about a quasi-autobiographical character called Roquentin and his aimless life in provincial Bouville, Mudtown. Precious little happens, but this is perhaps the greatest portrayal of the existential condition ever written. It is a deeply involving work, but it is also something more, that rarest entity, a philosophical novel that is neither abstract nor didactic. In a profound sense, this is what existentialism is. Sartre is nothing if not ambitious here. He poses the fundamental question, what am I? But he refuses to answer this in any intellectual way. For him the answer lies in describing and brilliantly evoking the very feel of existence. Sartre's phenomenological quest had now led him to expand his notion of contingency. Hume had shown that we experience no such thing as causality, going on to expand his argument. Necessity is something that exists in the mind, not in objects. In other words, we impose it on reality. It is an assumption, a prejudice, which may have proved vital to our evolution, but this does not mean it exists in reality. Hume saw all this intellectually. Sartre's brilliance was to realize the truth of this in experience, i.e., existentially. Everything was contingent. Indeed, our entire existence was permeated with contingency. Looked at in this way, the familiar skin of cause and effect, necessity and so forth, which cover the world, simply melts away. Take, for example, what happens when we look in the mirror. To begin with, we see something familiar, but the longer and more profoundly we scrutinize what we see, the more unfamiliar it becomes. In the same way, this unfamiliarity can extend to our entire existence. We thus exist free from all necessity, all certainty. But as Kierkegaard had shown, this realization of the world's strangeness and contingency, and our consequent freedom in it, brings anguish, angst, dread. For Sartre, Roquentin, this manifests itself as nausea, which is likened to the taste of oneself, the very flavour of existence. This phenomenological quest reaches its climax in a celebrated passage where Roquentin confronts and experiences the root of a chestnut tree. In an even more profound way than one's face loses its familiarity in the mirror, for Roquentin the particularity of the chestnut tree becomes utterly alien, and yet absorbing. It no longer had the inoffensiveness of an abstract category. It was the glue of actuality. This root was moulded in existence, the diversity of things. Their individuality was only an illusion, a veneer. This veneer had melted, given way to moist solidity, monstrous and chaotic, nude, fearfully and obscenely nude. Ultimately, reality was viscous and obscene. During this experience, Roquentin had been nothing but awareness, and concomitant with this awareness came the realization of the utter absurdity of everything. But once again, this was no intellectual realization. This absurdity was neither a mental idea nor a spoken word, but this long snake rotting at my feet, this wooden snake, i.e. the chestnut root. I realized that I'd found the key to existence, the key to my nausea, to my whole life. I'd experienced the absolute or the absurd. Confronting this large bulbous paw, the root, neither ignorance nor knowledge mattered. The world of explanations and reasons is not that of existence. As a result of this, Sartre understood, man is what he is in the present tense, and he's only there. This had important implications for those who sought meaning in their existence. One cannot put life into perspective while living it. It steals up on you from behind, and you find yourself inside it. Sartre wrote several drafts of La Nausée, and between times wrote a series of short stories. These are less profoundly philosophical, but have a distinctly existential feel to them. In contrast to the novel, they depict various attempts to escape responsibility for one's own existence. The best of these is The Wall, where a man facing death by execution tries to imagine an existence he might have lived rather than facing up to the reality of his actual existence. Industrious as ever, Sartre also wrote directly philosophical works in which he attempted to apply Husserl's phenomenological methods to an analysis of the emotions and the imagination. In Sketch for a Theory of the Emotions, the first inadequacies of the phenomenological approach become apparent. The emotions are viewed as an evasion of the phenomenological transparency that confronts existence naked. They create a magical world of self-delusion. In seeking a theory of the emotions, Sartre avoids a psychology of the emotions. Psychology is viewed as subordinate to philosophy, rather than as an integral part of the individual. We may achieve phenomenological transparency by using our reason rather than our emotions, but its object is hardly a reasonable state. Sartre's nothing but awareness may have the intellect in abeyance, but the vision of viscous, obscene, nude reality is charged with emotion. Likewise, the consequent brave attempt to take responsibility for our own existence and act accordingly can never totally elude psychological or emotional content. It may be salutary to try to act as if we are free of our psychology, but we can never completely achieve that freedom. Yet Sartre's insistence that we must never hide behind such things is undeniably a brave prescription for a philosophy of action. By now, de Beauvoir had a teaching post at nearby Rouen, and they would meet on the weekends. They also continued to correspond at length during the week. As they had intended at the outset, their relationship remained totally open. There were no secrets whatsoever between them. Yet here again this utter transparency would never be free of psychological undertones. Voyeurism and other murky elements soon became apparent. Apart from its transparency, the necessary relationship was not flourishing. Sartre and de Beauvoir no longer had sex, and the 30-year-old Sartre was developing an appetite for young girls. De Beauvoir was of course aware of this. He told her absolutely everything, in graphic detail, which seems to have appealed to the lesbian element in de Beauvoir. Possibly to ensure that she remained in control of the situation, de Beauvoir introduced Sartre to one of her 17-year-old students, but only after she too had enjoyed a brief fling with her. Wanda was a waif-like half-Russian who had long blonde hair and an anarchic temperament. Read Spinoza, Barefoot in Winter, etc. Later, Sartre would move on to Wanda's younger sister, Olga. Throughout, Sartre and de Beauvoir retained the exemplary transparency between themselves, but where the others were concerned, a web of deceit to match any bourgeois provincial hypocrisy was soon being spun. Sartre's other attempt at utter transparency was also not quite what it seemed. Years before even such accredited pioneers as Aldous Huxley, Sartre began experimenting with mescaline. It was under the hallucinogenic effects of this drug that he saw the vision of the chestnut tree root that he described in La Nocée. Whether it was mescaline or his own psychology that caused him to see ultimate reality as viscous and obscene is difficult to tell, and in a way irrelevant. La Nocée is presented as a work of fiction, and Sartre's brilliant rendition of his vision is a consummate metaphor for phenomenological transparency. Though this was not a first. Here literature was way behind art. A quarter of a century earlier, a similarly brilliant metaphorical deconstruction of our suppositions about reality had been achieved by the Cubists. In 1937, Sartre managed to secure a teaching post in Paris and was able to return to his beloved left bank. Once again he could write in the cafes. This was not an affectation. The left bank had been the thriving Latin quarter, student district of Paris since well before the time of the poet François Villon in the 15th century. Many of the houses were centuries old and lacked even basic facilities such as stoves for heating or cooking and reliable plumbing. The occupants of such accommodations spent much of their time in the countless cafes and cheap restaurants that had sprung up to remedy this domestic oversight. In April 1938, La Nocée was published, followed a few months later by a collection of Sartre's short stories entitled Le Mur, The Wall. Both were received with critical acclaim, establishing Sartre as the coming left-bank literary figure. In 1939, his Sketch for a Theory of the Emotions was published to somewhat less acclaim, but it nonetheless added to his intellectual street cred. Sartre was on the brink of fame, but Europe seemed to be on the brink of war. Sartre, however, had spent a year in Berlin and knew the reality behind Hitler's aggression. "I know the state of mind of the German people. Hitler couldn't possibly dream of going to war," he assured his friends. He's definitely bluffing. Next day, Hitler invaded Poland, and the French army was mobilized. Within 24 hours, Europe was at war, and Sartre was in uniform. "The war divided my life in two," Sartre wrote later. He was to emerge from this experience completely transformed, in all but the acumen of his political judgment. Sartre was posted to a meteorological unit at the Eastern Front overlooking the Rhine Valley. The Germans could never attack here. France's eastern border with Germany was protected by the impregnable Maginot Line, the last word in modern defence.